So this is a video that I've kind of been putting off filming for a little while. It's been close to a month, which is kind of weird to think about, honestly. But if you follow me on Twitter or Instagram, you probably know, what happened. But I've been putting off filming a video about this just because I knew this would be a hard video to film. I don't even think I'm going to edit this at all because it'd just be really hard to edit, I think. So this is probably going to be uploaded as a completely raw one cut video, so I apologize if you don't like that kind of video, but this video isn't really meant for entertainment purposes anyways, so yeah. But essentially I've been putting off making this video because I just didn't really want to sit down and talk about it, because it's not an easy thing to talk about. If you didn't know, my chameleon George, my carpet chameleon Furcifer lateralis, had to be put to sleep, euthanized, close to a month ago. If you only follow me on YouTube and not any other social medias, this might be quite shocking. If you follow me on Twitter or Instagram, you probably have a better idea of what's been going on, as I've been doing like updates on there frequently. I planned on doing an update video on here, but unfortunately things went downhill a lot quicker than I was expecting them to, so I never got around to making an update video. So for those of you who just follow me here on YouTube, the last thing that you would have seen about George was that a few months ago I did a video titled "My Chameleon Needed Surgery," and I talked about how George had developed a swollen ankle, and I took him to the vet. They told me that it was due to an infection, so they prescribed George some pain medication and some antibiotics to help the infection. So there's unfortunately quite a long story with what happened since I filmed that video, so I'm going to go over it all right now. This could be a long video. I'm going to try to sum it up as quickly as I can, but there's a lot to it. So yeah, so let's get into it. So back in March, right after I came home from Aquashella, I noticed that George had a swollen ankle. After noticing this, I made an appointment at the regular vet that I see for my exotic animals to have him checked out. So I think they were able to get, I don't remember exactly, but they were able to get him in really quickly after I called. I think it might have been same day or next day. Either way, it was really quick. So I took him in and they did some tests and whatnot, and it took them a few days to get all the results and stuff, but after all that happened, it came back. I was told that he likely had a bone infection, and bone infections often take a long time to heal, I was told. It can usually be around 8 to 10 weeks on antibiotics. So they prescribed me with some, well, not me, they prescribed George some antibiotics and pain medication, which I was giving to him daily. Now, I started doing this for a few weeks. I wasn't really noticing much change, I would say, after 2 weeks or so, but they did tell me that bone infections can take a long time to heal, so I wasn't overly concerned until I would say about the 3-week mark, when I noticed his leg getting more swollen. I want to put a little disclaimer here that all of this happened over like 3-ish month span, So I'm probably forgetting things, possibly mixing a few things up. I'm going to try my best, but this has been like 3 months, so it is a lot to remember. I also want to point out, oh, what was the other thing I wanted to point out? I forget the other thing I wanted to point out. If I remember it, I will let you know. Oh, the other thing I wanted to point out is that I'm not a vet. I have absolutely no medical training, so if I'm saying a few things, like, I don't know, maybe you're a vet or like a vet tech or someone watching this, if I'm saying a few things incorrectly, I apologize. It's not my intentions. I'm just not a vet, so I'm trying my best. So after about 3 weeks, I noticed his leg getting more swollen, which was concerning to me because it was supposed to be getting better. He was on medication, which was supposed to heal him. So after that 3 weeks, I went back to the vet and I, brought it up to them that I thought it was getting more swollen, and they kind of brushed it off. They said, bone infections take a long time to heal. I wouldn't worry about it. Continue with the antibiotics. But at this point, they decided to prescribe a second antibiotic to help. So he was already on an oral antibiotic, an oral pain medication, and now in addition to those, they prescribed an injectable antibiotic. I don't remember, the correct names for any of them, but so he was now getting pain medication every day, antibiotics every day. Those were the oral ones that I was giving him by syringe. And now they also wanted to give him injectable antibiotics every second day. Now this is something I could have done at home, or I could have them do it at the vet. Now I've given injectable antibiotics before. I had a ball python who required them, who was a rescue that I took in, and I was able to give them to him, no issue. When it came to George, I wasn't confident to do it myself because he was so small. George weighed around 12 grams. This is very, very tiny, so I chose to have the vets do it. So I took him in every 2 days. The vet's about a half-hour drive for me, so I was driving an hour back and forth every second day to get George his antibiotics. And now this did concern me a bit because I knew obviously the vet trips would be stressful, especially that frequently with that long of a drive. But I had hope that it would benefit him in the long run because he was getting the medication that he needed. After a few more days, it didn't take long, I noticed a open sore developing on his tail. And the swelling in his leg wasn't getting any better at all. So when I brought George in for his next injection, I brought this up to them, and now I had been doing some research myself, looking on, just the internet, which I know isn't always, the most reliable, but what else are you gonna do? I was looking in Facebook groups, speaking to other chameleon owners, and I spoke to a carpet chameleon breeder, and after all of this research that I had done, I was worried that it may be cancer, that it wasn't a bone infection, because he had this growing lump on his ankle, and now he developed this open sore on his tail that almost resembled a melanoma. So at this point I got worried that George, didn't have a bone infection and that he had cancer and that it was spreading. So I mentioned this to the vet, and they still seemed pretty persistent on the fact that they thought it was an infection, but I had kind of insisted that they do a biopsy to check if it was cancerous. They agreed to do that, so we scheduled that for, it was a few days later, I think. They had to, make sure the proper vet was in to do it. So that was scheduled. Now, I want to say I was originally under the impression that the biopsy was going to be done on his ankle because that's where the swelling was. That's where, you know, the main issue was. That's where it all started. So I was under the impression that the biopsy was going to be done on his ankle. So now, fast forward a few days, I bring him into the vet. The biopsy that they were doing was a punch biopsy, and so it required him being sedated. So they had me drop him off in the morning so that they could, you know, do all the preparations that they needed to do for his surgery. And then they gave me a call later in the afternoon when he was ready to be discharged and picked up. So they gave me a phone call. I, at the time, was at the gym. I was doing one of my training sessions and my phone rang, so I stepped off to get the call. And it was one of the vet techs who called me, and they told me over the phone that I have no idea how it was worded, this was a while ago, but essentially told me that they went ahead and amputated his tail. So for those of you who don't know, I didn't say anything over the phone just because I was speaking to a vet tech, not the actual vet who did the surgery. I was at the gym. I was in the middle of a session with my trainer. I wasn't about to, you know, go off at some person on the phone. So I just said, okay, thank you. I set up a time to go to the vet to pick him up, and I asked to speak with them because when I found out that his tail was amputated, I had a lot of emotions. I was confused, first off, because I didn't understand why they amputated his tail when I thought they were doing a biopsy on his ankle. I also didn't understand why they performed an amputation without my consent. They had never called me or to ask me if I could do this. Before I dropped him off, I consented to a punch biopsy and a punch biopsy only. So I was confused about that, and I was mostly sad and angry because, so for those of you who don't know, chameleons have prehensile tails, meaning their tail kind of acts like a fifth limb. They use it for balance and support and just, you know, getting around. They'll wrap their tails around branches and everything like that. And so at this point, George's mobility was already compromised because he had an ankle so swollen that he couldn't really use it. So his mobility was already compromised, and then they went ahead and amputated his tail without my consent, therefore limiting his mobility even more. So at this point I was very upset, to say the least, because I was worried about his quality of life at this point, because he went from having, you know, essentially 5 functional limbs to having 3, which is, you know, a significant difference. When his ankle started giving him problems, he started relying on his tail even more to help give him balance and support, and then they removed the tail. So I was really angry. I asked to speak to someone at the vet, and they had me speak with another vet tech. I guess the vet wasn't there anymore, the vet who performed the surgery. So again, I wasn't, you know, going to get mad at the vet tech who I was speaking to because they weren't the one who did it. So I just kind of addressed my concerns with them, and then they passed it along to the vet, who then called me the next day to apologize. But, you know, an apology doesn't give him his tail back. So they told me that the reason for amputating the tail was that there was that spot on his tail that I mentioned before, the open sore, and I guess that's what they wanted to biopsy, even though I was under the impression they were biopsying the ankle. I don't know if that was just a miscommunication or what, but either way, they, I guess, planned on biopsying the tail. And since it was so small, they didn't think that they could get a good enough biopsy just from doing whatever the normal punch biopsy is. So they ended up removing like the last 2 inches of his tail. I do want to say they didn't remove the whole thing. He did still have part of his tail, but they removed, you know, a significant portion of it, and especially where the end is what they use most to grasp onto, it definitely had a really negative impact on his life, I would say. So at this point, I bring him home. Obviously, I'm still very upset and angry and whatever else you can imagine I was feeling. So I brought him home and I got him back in his enclosure. And I monitored him for a few days. Now, keep in mind, the biopsy results took a while. Biopsy, if you can even call it that, because it was just a whole amputation, but you know, for purposes we will call it a biopsy. So the biopsy results take a while to get back in because they have to send them to some other lab in a different province, and yeah, so it took a little while, not like super long, maybe a week or so. But in the meantime, I had brought George back home and continued with his medication, the antibiotics and the pain medication. I noticed he, with his tail amputation and with a swollen leg, he was not able to get around his enclosure as well as he used to be. He was more prone to falling because he didn't have all the grip that he should have had. So at this point, I went ahead and I ordered another new cage for him, a smaller one, so that it would be easier for him to get around and do what he needed to do. At this point, I do want to mention, I probably should have said this earlier, but he was starting to develop more lumps in other parts of his body. So he started developing a few lumps in his tail. His other limbs started getting affected. He had a fairly large lump on one of his front leg shoulders. Some of his other ankles were starting to be affected. And yeah, so at this point, I was having to make a lot of modifications in his enclosure to keep him safe and make sure that he was doing all right. At this point, I didn't think his, I thought his quality of life was definitely impacted due to the amputation and the lumps forming and everything, but it wasn't bad enough that I felt that he, needed to be put to sleep at this point. He was still eating just fine. He was still drinking just fine. He was still able to move with some limitations, but I made accommodations for that by getting him a smaller cage, by making it a lot more full so that if he did fall, he would get caught by some plants, like he wouldn't fall right to the bottom and stuff like that. So there's that. And then I get a call about a week later from the vet informing me that he did not have an infection and he never had an infection. What he had the whole time was gout, and the lumps forming in his joints were, a result of the gout, which at this point had been going on for 2 months, and he was being treated incorrectly, which unfortunately actually made it worse. Not only was the gout just not being treated, but a lot of the time, you know, gout is essentially a result of, you know, some sort of like kidney failure. I don't know all the medical sides to it because, again, I'm not a vet or anything, but it's a result of kidney failure. And he was put onto 3 medications which had not been tested to be safe with gout. If you didn't know, if you're taking certain medications, it can be processed through the kidney, and if you're already, you know, in kidney failure like George was, having to process different medications is just going to worsen the kidneys, which, you know, can result in the issue, in this case, which is gout, getting worse really quickly. So that's what happened to him. The gout started getting really bad over a very short period of time. In the span of just a few weeks, he had gone from having just 1 swollen ankle to having 4 swollen ankles, swollen shoulders, swollen tails, and everything like that. So and one of the reasons I was so upset by this is when I first brought him in, the very first time I brought him in, I said that gout was one of my concerns because gout presents usually as swollen joints, and they supposedly tested for gout and told me that he didn't have any. So they completely missed the diagnosis and treated him incorrectly for months, put him through unnecessary treatment. He was getting injections every 2 days, which was incredibly stressful. He had a tail amputation, which was incredibly stressful. Just so much that happened that shouldn't have ever happened is what I'm getting at. It should have been a case of I brought him in, they checked for gout, saw that he had gout, and put him on treatment right away. And I think if that's what happened, I think that he would still be here right now, which is really awful to think about. So yeah, and I do want to mention at this point I had already stopped the antibiotic injections. I basically stopped those right after they amputated his tail, because at that point I just knew they weren't doing anything. I was fed up and I said enough is enough. So I just stopped them. I was still giving him the medication at home, but I stopped the injections. And then I got that call informing me that he had gout. So they told me that there was a medication they could prescribe to help treat it. At this point, I obviously didn't really want to work with this vet anymore. I want to point out I have since found another vet that I can see for my reptiles, but at the time I didn't want to work with this vet anymore, so I found a new vet, but they told me they couldn't prescribe him any medications without seeing him, and they didn't have availability to see him for like 2 more weeks, and I didn't want to wait because that just wouldn't be fair to him, making him wait even longer for the medication that he should have had 2 months ago. So I got the medication through the vet that I had been working with, and so then I started giving him that, and it just didn't do anything. Sorry, my camera just it stops recording at a certain point, just stopped recording anyways. So I started giving him the medication. He was getting it every day. This was supposedly supposed to treat his gout, and it just didn't do anything. Now, there are other things I did in combination with this to try to help treat it. One thing when they have gout that's really important is hydration. So, I mean, well, he's always had, you know, his mistings and a dripper and proper humidity and everything. I also started giving him water by hand. So every day I was getting some water in a syringe and giving it to him to make sure he was staying hydrated. But unfortunately, it just didn't seem to be doing much. But at this point, again, he was still eating just fine. He was enthusiastic to eat. He would go and get his food, no problem. He was basking and, you know, doing all the normal stuff. So I wasn't overly concerned about his quality of life at this point. You know, I obviously knew that it wasn't the best that it could be. But with the modifications that I made for him, I still thought that it was okay. So I continued to keep him like that for, I would say, maybe 2 weeks, giving him the gout medication and everything like that. And it was, you know, I can't really say anything about it. It wasn't getting better, but it wasn't getting worse. And then he went into shed. So he started shedding and I could just kind of left him alone for a day, but because of the limited mobility that he had with, you know, swollen joints and stuff, he just wasn't able to get it all off on his own. I didn't want to try to help him right away, so I gave him about a day to see how much he could get off, and then after a day he still had almost all of the shed still on him, and you know, you could just tell he was, you know, not having a good time. So I went to take him out of the enclosure to help him shed, and this is where things went downhill really, really fast. So I took him out of the enclosure to start working on the shed, and one of the first things I noticed was his tail, where he had the amputation performed, had completely opened up. It was just a big open wound. And now I want to point out, the wound from the surgery was completely healed at this point. It wasn't like a scab picked off or anything. It was completely healed, and all of a sudden it was this massive open wound, and I don't really know how that happened. So, and then I started looking at him closer, and his ankle, the one that was originally swollen, had gotten so swollen that it split open. One of his toes also had an open sore on it, and this had all popped up within the day. Like, I mean, I'm telling you, it's not like this was something that had happened over like a week or more that I missed, because I was having to take him out of his enclosure every single day to give him medication. Like, I was seeing him up close every single day. So this isn't just, you know, these happened very, very quickly, like all just in the one day that he went into shed. So this was right before I was getting ready to go to bed. You know, it was like kind of the last thing I did for the day was to give him his medication and stuff. That was like the very last part of the day. And I, at this point, after seeing the open wounds, I just knew that it was time, which is, it's really, really hard to make the decision to have to euthanize an animal, but it's really hard when it happens so suddenly in such a almost traumatic way to just, you know, I just wanted to take him out of his enclosure to help get the stuck shut off, and then you find a bunch of open wounds on their body. It's really, really hard. So at this point it was kind of later in the night. Like I said, it was sort of the last thing I do before of the night. So any regular vets around me were closed, so I had to drive to the 24-hour emergency vet and have him euthanized there. Which is just, it's really, really hard and it sucks a lot. So that's what happened there. After I had him put to sleep, I chose to have him cremated. They offer that service through the vet, so I didn't really have to do anything there. I just, you know, after he was euthanized, I left him there for the cremation, and then they called me when he was ready to be picked up. And for me, that happened to be the day that I came home from Arizona from Pet Fest. All this happened like where I had to bring him to the vet and stuff. This was all kind of right before I left for Pet Fest for Arizona. It was just a few days before, which really, really sucked. I think this was the Saturday, and it was Saturday night, and I left for Arizona on Wednesday, so it was, you know, just a few days beforehand. But the cremation company that the vet goes through was out of province, so they, you know, have to send the body off, and then they have the cremation done, and then it gets sent back. So I think it took around, they told me it would be 10 to 14 days, and they would call me when he was ready to be picked up. And just as I had landed back home here in Nova Scotia, I was waiting for my bag at the baggage claim, and I got a call from the vet saying that he was ready to be picked up. So I left the airport and I went straight to the vet to get him and bring him home. So that's about where we're at right now. I have him back home. I think, you know, obviously as sad as this all is, it's good to have him back here, and I have some really nice pieces of artwork to, you know, remember him through. I'm gonna go and show you guys the setup that I have for him. So this is the area that I was talking about that I have set up. So this box right here is George's ashes. So it says right on the top, George 2019. So his ashes are in this box. Right here I have this kind of picture of him. It's like sewn. I don't remember what the right word is for this, but that's what I have there. And up here I have this, you know, decorative plate that was made for me with my chameleons on it. So Pascal is up there, and then these two are, you know, like George. So, you know, it's really nice to have some nice things like this to remember them by. As, you know, as sad as it is, it's nice to have something like this. But yeah, that's essentially what happened. It's definitely hard when something like this happens, because you blame yourself and you blame others, and you just don't really know what to do. Like I have said before, I think had he been diagnosed correctly when I first took him in, I think that he would still be here now. And it sucks that he had to have such a rough few months. Like, you know, I just can't imagine. I just can't imagine it. It just, you know, to be incorrectly treated for months and months while the issue just got worse and worse. It just really, really sucks. And then you're in a situation like that, you blame the vet for, you know, misdiagnosing and incorrectly treating and performing amputations without your consent and all kinds of things like that. And then you blame yourself for trusting that vet, you know. It makes you think like, oh, I should have went somewhere else. I wish I had gone to another vet. Why didn't I find a new vet sooner? And just everything like that. And it just really, really sucks. But I needed to update you guys on what happened, and I appreciate those of you who, you know, stayed through this whole video. I know it's definitely a long one, but I think that, you know, there was just a lot to it. I tried to sum it up as quickly as I could, but this is literally 3 months of my life that I just summed up into 30 minutes or however long this video is. So just, you know, as awful as it all sounded in this video, as sad as it is to say, it was probably 10 times worse in, you know, in real life, and it really, really sucks. Yeah. I also want to point out that this video will be monetized. Over the time that George spent in the vet, I probably spent, you know, between $1,500 and $2,000 on all of the treatments, you know, unnecessary treatments, that is. I was not able to get any of my money back for anything. So I spent a lot of money on these treatments, and I'm working on paying that off right now. You know, it was pretty well all put on a credit card, which I need to pay off. So I apologize for getting all personal with my financial things, but I have, you know, vet bills to pay off, so this video will be monetized. I'm sorry if you don't like that, but I need to pay off these vet bills, so yeah. So that's what happened to George. And it still just really, really sucks a lot, because I hate that this had to happen. I wish, you know, obviously every animal is going to die at some point, but thinking about the months that led up to this is just horrible, and I just wish that it didn't have to be that way. I just really wish it didn't have to be that way.